Open up the door, it's Dave! Who?
September 12th, 1962. John F. Kennedy stands up in front of the crowd at Rice University and says the immortal words,
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space.
And it's true, NASA went about a great effort to get us to the moon. Kennedy was assassinated about a year later, but yet the spirit of that lived on, and everyone made the goal of getting to the moon a top priority. It was a lot of focus of NASA, it was a lot of effort that went into it. We spent a lot of time, energy, and money as a nation to get us to the moon. It was a race with the Soviet Union, it was a race with other countries and making sure that we had the superiority to get to the moon. And yeah, we did it. So in 1969, we landed a man on the moon, which is one of the most exciting and memorable things that we've ever done.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Tower cleared.
Okay, we got a roll program. Neil Armstrong reporting the roll and pitch program, which puts Apollo 11 on a proper heading. Plus 30 seconds.
4 forward, drift into the right a little. 30 seconds. Forward, drift. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. We copy you down, Eagle. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. I'm at the foot of the ladder. The LEM footbeds are only depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches, although the surface appears to be very, very fine-grained as you get close to it. It's almost like a powder. Ground mass is very fine. I'm going to step off the LEM. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
So over the course of the next few years, we landed 6 spacecraft on the moon and 12 men walked on the moon. It would have been 7 spacecraft and 14 people if not for the accident that happened with Apollo 13.
Hey, Houston, we've had a problem here.
Can say again, please.
Houston, we've had a problem.
Explosion occurred on the damaged tank, but that also ruptured the second tank.
But they did orbit the moon and come back safely. So you had 12 men that landed there. And the last 2 were Harrison Schmitt and Gene Cernan. And they landed there in December of 1972 and left to come back to Earth.
I was strolling on the moon one day in a merry, merry month of December. Now, May, when much to my surprise, a pair of bunny eyes. Oh, is this a neat way to travel? Isn't it great? 3, 2, 1, ignition. Right away, Houston. Brakes are good. Excellent.
And we, as humans, haven't been back to the moon since. Why did the lunar missions end? Because it was expensive. Because Nixon realized this wasn't a profitable thing to do. People were losing interest. We had no goals beyond just landing on the moon. We got to the moon, and what happens next? And so that was a big problem. We didn't have any specific goals of anything we wanted to do except getting to the moon. And because of the cost of it, Nixon basically canceled the program and decided to go on to some reusable type spacecraft where we could go to other places. We could be in space. We could be doing other things. And we had a space station we put up there, and he planned for something that ultimately became the space shuttle. So it's a positive outcome in a way, but it's too bad that we didn't continue that momentum. There was no interest in it. It just was dying off because no one really wanted to spend the money, the time, the effort, the energy, and we'd already been to the moon now. and people were losing interest. Now, we landed the 6 lunar modules there on sort of the northern part of the moon, where it's a little bit more sunny and there's a little bit more understanding of what's going on. But over the course of the 50 years since then, we've been trying to get back to the moon. As a world, as a planet, we've been trying to get back to our moon. And in that time, Russia, China, Japan, and India have all landed space probes there. The United States wanted to land something there and tried for several years to try and get something going. But as I've talked about in the past, with the problems with NASA's administration and the way things work and the cost overruns, it never really worked out. So, flash forward to 2023. NASA is now working with various private companies that are trying to get into space. And it's really amazing what's going on there. So then Astrobiotix came up with this idea for a lunar lander that could do some soil samples and do some measurements and take some telemetry readings from the southern part of the moon. And they went up in February of this year. And unfortunately, they suffered a problem with their hydraulics, and they weren't able to successfully land on the moon, and they had to make an executive decision to actually orbit the moon once and then bring the spacecraft back to Earth and burn it up in orbit, which is kind of a shame. But right behind it was the next spacecraft, Intuitive Machines, which was going to take off in late February and land on the moon. So it actually did take off. It had a very successful mission where they were able to leave Earth on a SpaceX flight, and they were able to depart and head toward the moon. Very exciting times. They made it all the way to the moon and without any problems. And then as they're getting ready to land, there was a problem. They didn't know what the problem was at first. When you're looking in the room and you're watching the space flight controllers, they're all looking kind of concerned and looking at the screens and don't really know what they're seeing. The spacecraft apparently landed, and they did get a signal back from it a few minutes after it landed, maybe half an hour or so afterwards, but they weren't sure what the signal was telling them.
On the 8th day of a 250,000-mile voyage, a voyage along the Great Cosmic Bridge, a commercial lander named Odysseus, powered by a company called Intuitive Machines, launched upon a SpaceX rocket carrying a bounty of NASA scientific instruments and bearing the dream of a new adventure in science, innovation, and American leadership in space. Well, all of that aced the landing of a lifetime. Today, for the first time in more than a half century, the U.S. has returned to the moon.
And then eventually they figured it out, that the spacecraft had tipped over, that it hadn't actually landed straight up and down perpendicular like they expected it to. And it turns out that there was a switch that they didn't switch inside the spacecraft that would turn on the laser guidance system. They were supposed to turn it on at some point before they actually launched from the Cape Canaveral, but they didn't flip the switch, and unfortunately the laser guidance system didn't come on, so they didn't have great telemetry to be able to automatically land the craft. So they wound up landing at the edge of a crater and tipping over. I think they said it was 18 degrees of a tip, but in any event, it was enough to make the mission not a complete success. It wasn't a failure by any stretch of the imagination, but it wasn't as successful as they would have liked. And that meant that they couldn't orient the solar arrays toward the sun to be able to collect enough energy to keep the batteries charged and run all of the experiments they have on there. I think they said they have something like 6 major experiments and a couple of other things, but they don't have enough energy to be able to run all of them. So what they did was ran as many as they could, downloaded as much data as they could, and they're trying to keep it running as much as they can, though I guess there's some talk about them shutting down the operation at some point and just calling it quits and going for the next mission. But here's the interesting thing. It was a success. And this is a publicly traded company, Intuitive Machines. And it was interesting because when they launched, their stock price went up. When they landed, their stock price continued to go up. And then when they found out that the machine had tipped over, their stock price actually dropped 30% as a result of that. As I said, it was not a failure, but yet their stock price dropped because of that. It's really strange how this works sometimes and how the market reacts to the strangest things. It was not a failure. In fact, I think it's a good investment for the future because they're going to get it right the next time. Now, on a related note, I wanted to mention something about this switch they didn't flip. So back when I worked at NASA, one of the projects I worked on was payload processing. And one of the important things that they used to do was to take everything that was going into space on that next mission, whatever shuttle mission that was, and to put it into a module and plug it in so that it was all part of an integrated system. So they could just lift that module up, put it inside the space shuttle and run it. But the important thing was testing everything out while it was sitting in the high bay at the operations and checkout building so that they could verify that everything was working and all the switches that needed to be switched were flipped correctly. The inherent problem is you have a very long procedure because you may have 100 experiments that are flying and all of them need to be tested. So it takes many days to test it and make sure it's working right. But at least the principle was there at that point, that they were thinking through how do they make sure that all of the switches are switched so they don't miss one. And that's what's interesting about this. It's kind of funny how this all works out, that this has happened before. In fact, there was another probe that went out into space to explore an asteroid, and it took a core sample and brought it back to Earth. And when they brought it back to Earth, it actually, the parachute didn't deploy properly. It detached and the parachute flew away and it crashed to Earth. Now, fortunately, they were able to recover what was inside, but the reason for the parachute deploying incorrectly was because someone made a mistake and cross-connected it. So it wasn't connected up to the module itself, it was connected to the piece that exploded off. So these things happen, right? This is the kind of thing, this is the human error part of this. When you're a pilot, one of the important things is you have a checklist. It's a checklist of everything you have to do before you take off. It's a written document that you look through and you go, I did this, I did this, I did this, I did this. And I think it's important to remember that we need to be doing that for space too, to make sure that every single thing is done, that it's not just someone has to remember, oh, I should do that. You have to have it kind of documented and go, I did this, check. I did this, check. I did this, and make sure that everything is done correctly. So that's my take on it. But I think it's really fascinating, and I think we're really into an interesting time right now where we are exploring space and we're ready for something else. We're ready for that next adventure. We're ready to do something else in space exploration and on the moon and maybe make a moon base, maybe. I don't know if that's a financially savvy thing to do, but it's worth talking about at least, and I'm very excited about it. I wanted to take just a minute at the end of this video to address an elephant in the room, and that's the conspiracy theories that the moon landing was a hoax. And I have to say that that insults me personally. We, as a nation, did something amazing, did something tremendously great, and got ourselves to the moon. And yeah, you can say that with the technology today, we're having trouble landing on the moon. How did we do it in the 60s and 70s? And it was done through sheer determination. And you know what? Honestly, it would have taken more effort to create a hoax than it would have been to actually land on the moon. So I'm going to disagree with you if you think that.
What's your point, David?